Greenspan was there to backstop the markets. In fact, Wall Street started calling it the Greenspan put, that Greenspan was there to protect everybody from losses or declines, and he kept flooding the market with cheap money. And that's what fueled the internet bubble. It wasn't as cheap as the money that the Fed provided in the next decade, but it was still very cheap and plentiful. And the fear was that, well, if there ever was a big market meltdown, Greenspan would come to the rescue. So that caused people to be more aggressive than they normally would, and that created more credit to fuel this expansion and funding of a lot of these dot-com companies. So that, and when you combine that with what was going on legitimately in the internet that was revolutionary, you combined that new technology, this new investment landscape with the cheap money and the Greenspan put, and you fooled the bubble. But it wasn't nearly as damaging to the economy as the second bubble, because the losses in the dot-com bubble were confined to the people who invested in the dot-coms. And yes, there were some misallocations. Businesses were started that shouldn't have been started. Resources were poorly invested. And the market would have corrected all that through a rather painful but short recession in 2001, 2002. But when that process got aggravated by September 11th, and George Bush comes to town, and he doesn't want to preside over a deep recession and get blamed for it, he does what's politically expedient with the help of the Fed, and then they just throw all caution to the wind, and they pursue much more reckless monetary policy than we had in the 90s, and we got a much bigger, much more devastating housing bubble.
I understand. And what was it that preceded the inflation in the 70s? Was there a bubble then that caused?
Yeah, I mean, where you got the inflation in the 1970s was the Lyndon Johnson war, Great Society, war on poverty, guns and butter, Vietnam, mission to the moon. We started running big deficits in the 1960s, and ultimately that's what paved the way for Nixon's devaluations and ultimately abandoning the gold standard. We got rid of all monetary discipline by 1971, and the dollar was no longer tied to gold, and so it didn't float. It sank like a stone. But the inflation of the 70s were rooted in the big government policies of the 60s, and just like the inflation that we are experiencing now is rooted in the big government policies that we've pursued since, particularly under President Bush, because government spending grew dramatically under President Bush, and now it's growing even faster under President Obama.
If you don't mind, what about the Roaring '20s? What was it that was going on in the Roaring '20s?
Well, the same thing. Remember, the Federal Reserve started in 1913. And it kicked up a lot of inflation during the First World War, and so it was too easy. They had to tighten in 1920, which brought about a very severe economic contraction, actually worse than 1929. But the government stayed out, and the market corrected itself. But then what happened during the mid-1920s is that Britain was in trouble. The British pound was weak, and our central bankers, who were friendly with the British central bankers, tried to prop up the pound by deliberately debasing the dollar, by keeping U.S. interest rates too low during most of the 1920s. And it was that cheap money policy of the 20s that fueled the stock market speculation. You didn't see the inflation in consumer goods because we were a very productive country that, we would have had falling consumer prices, but they weren't falling because of all the efficiencies. But stock prices were rising, real estate prices were rising as a result of the cheap money supplied, particularly between like 1925 and 1929. In fact, if you read Alan Greenspan's essay from Gold and Economic Freedom, I quoted it in my book Crash Proof, but Alan Greenspan does a very good job of explaining why the Depression of the 1930s had its roots in the Fed monetary policy of the 1920s. And guys like Ben Bernanke believe that the reason the Fed caused the Depression is because the Fed was too tight during the 1930s. That's not the reason. It was because they were too loose during the 1920s and inflated the bubble. They got it right when they raised interest rates. That was the right thing to do. They never should have lowered them so low in the first place. The problem was the government came in and tried to make the economy better with their own version of bailouts and stimulus, and that's why we had the Great Depression. The problem is Ben Bernanke is clueless as to what the Fed's real role was in creating that disaster, and so his revisionist version of history ensures that if we follow the Bernanke prescription, what we are going to experience is going to be much worse than the Great Depression, because it will be the greater inflationary depression that we're going to get.
Right. I guess that's just the conventional wisdom, is that the tightening is what caused the depression.
No. We had to tighten eventually, but it was the loosening that made the tightening necessary. But if we had failed to tighten, we wouldn't have averted the depression. It would have been worse if we just kept on printing, and then we got the same Hoover, Roosevelt big government policies.
Sure. What I'm saying is that they blame it on the tightening. They're saying that.
Yeah, well, they're wrong. They always want to do that. The whole experience of the 1930s of the Depression was seized by the socialists to try to indict capitalism and justify an expansive role of U.S. government, when it's the opposite. If we had a more free market-oriented capitalistic system, none of that would have happened. It was the fact that we veered from it with the cheap money of the Fed and the big government policies of Hoover, Roosevelt. That's why we had the boom, the bust, and the Depression. The free market would have averted all that.
Gotcha.
Anyway, thank you very much for your call. We've actually spoken about this topic for the entire segment, so I think we only have one more segment left to go. So don't go away. We'll be back after this message. You're listening to The Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com. You know, there's some sound that I've had on my desk here for about a week, and I never seem to have time to play it. So let me play it today so I can get rid of it. But anyway, it's from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and it's sound from Richard Trumka, who is the president of AFL-CIO, who was there talking up the unions. What else? But listen to what he tells a CNBC about unions. This is cut number 9.
Is there a willingness on the part of organized labor? And what would it take, conceivably, when we say shared, for organized labor to see in terms of sacrifice from other places to actually sacrifice as well?
Well, let's talk about shared sacrifice. Workers have given up their jobs. Many have lost their homes. They've lost their pensions, and their wages have been cut. All because we had a financial sector that was out of control. They still are getting record bonuses. We would love to have shared sacrifice, because that would mean we'd get a little break for a while and they'd have to pay a little bit.
Okay, so first of all, he's talking about the workers who have given up their jobs and have lost their homes and their pensions and had their wages cut. Yes, there are plenty of workers who have sacrificed. The problem is these aren't the union workers, right? These are the non-union workers. The union workers, particularly the union workers for local state governments, they've been getting pay raises during the entire recession. They haven't had the cuts. That is where we need the sacrifice. We're not talking about the people who have already been laid off. In fact, a lot of people are out of work because of the labor unions. And, he's blaming it all on the financial crisis. It's not. The labor unions have been destroying jobs in this country for decades. If you look at the union, the industries that were the most heavily unionized industries, that's where we've lost it. Manufacturing. The reason that all the manufacturers are gone, one of the reasons is because they were heavily unionized companies. The reason that the unions are thriving in state and local business government is because it doesn't matter how inefficient they make the government. They just pass on the inefficiencies in the form of higher taxes or bigger budget deficits in the states, and now it's blowing up in our face. Here, let's continue with more Trumka, cut number 10.
What do you think when unions and Wall Street are frankly very close together in terms of sort of public perception?
Well, first of all, it's not by accident. When Ronald Reagan back in the 70s put this country on a low-wage, high-consumption strategy, they had to start attacking unions. So for 30 years, they've been attacking unions, trying to weaken us every way they can. Now, when you talk to workers are still interested in unions. They still know that they need support. They need the voice and the strength of a union. And quite frankly, it's the only way that we're going to solve this.
First of all, he didn't deliberately put us on a low-wage strategy. Yes, I mean, he had that famous scuffle with the air traffic controllers. But what destroyed union jobs was unions themselves. It was the unions making their employers unproductive in global markets. That's why the jobs disappeared. That and high taxes and high regulations. But the unions were a driving force there because the unions worked hard to elect Democratic congressmen to support their reelection who were pushing many of the mandates and taxes and regulations that made their employers so uncompetitive and destroyed their jobs. And finally, let's play cut number 11.
You can't create demand when 72% of your economy is driven by consumer spending and those wages are stagnant. We were borrowing to try to make that happen. From 46 to 73, productivity in the country doubled and so did wages. That's when we built the middle class. We had about 38% of the members or the workers in the country were covered by unions then. So collective bargaining was driving wages for everybody, not just union workers, but non-union workers. From 73 to date, productivity has continued up, but wages have flattened. And we're down to about 12.5% of the workforce right now, so we don't drive those wages. That's why you're seeing the growing inequality. That's why you're seeing 20%, for the last 20 years, 56% of all income gains have gone to the top 1%.
See, he's got it wrong. I mean, he's right to look at productivity, but what drove the wage gains back in that earlier period was the productivity. It was higher productivity that made higher wages possible. And that's where demand comes from. It actually comes from production that would have brought about lower prices. If it wasn't for the inflation that the government was creating, wages wouldn't have risen, but prices would have fallen instead, and we would have had more demand based on lower prices and higher productivity. But the problem today is productivity isn't growing. The government claims it's growing, but it's not. This is all a lie manufactured by government statisticians. We're not getting the higher productivity, and that's why we're not getting higher real wages, because there's no production. You do not create demand by increasing wages. You create demand by increasing supply and bringing down prices, which means that incomes go further. In fact, if you force higher wages into an unproductive economy, you're going to destroy demand because it's going to lead to higher prices for everybody, including the unionized workers. Anyway, let me try to take a final call before we go. I've got Mark holding on from Texas. Mark, how are you?
You know, Peter, I was willing to join in and do my part, for this shared sacrifice. In fact, I actually started packing. But I guess my plane ticket to Davos must have got lost in the mail. Anyway.
So what's your question?
Job one for the government is to mask inflation. The manufacturers do it. They might put filler in our products. They might lower the portions or the size that we buy. There's lots of different ways. But you remember, Peter, there's a large food retail company that just come out last week, said they were going to have to raise their prices. This is where the majority of Americans go to get their burgers and fries. Mm-hmm. Now, when does this stimulus money stop? I'm going to suggest to you, when we found out they were on the list, my bottom jaw dropped. The government masks inflation through stimulus money also, Peter.
In what respect? I mean, I know that the government is lying about inflation all the time. The numbers don't report it correctly because they're so massaged between hedonics and substitution and geometric weighting. The government has all kinds of fancy ways, and every time they change the way they calculated consumer prices, and it started under Alan Greenspan, It was designed because they said that the CPI was overstating inflation. They kept telling us it was overstating inflation, and they were going to fix it so that it didn't overstate inflation anymore. The reality was they wanted to create inflation, but they didn't want the CPI to reveal it. It was like they were trying to rig it. It's like they wanted to give the economy a fever, but they wanted to use a thermometer that was stuck at 98.6 so we wouldn't know that it was getting sick. And that's what they did.
It's going to end up being a rubber band effect. I'm with you on the creativity they use when picking the criteria for the CPI. But what I'm trying to get at, though, the stimulus funds that they gave to this major food servicer kept the hamburger prices down.
Oh, okay, yeah. I know what you're saying. So instead of having to raise prices, they got a government bailout, which enabled them not to raise prices. But of course, in order to give them the stimulus money, we had to print it, which means prices are ultimately going to go up even more because we held it off for a while.
It's the rubber band effect, and it's going to twang big time real fast.
Yeah, but look, I was talking about this with Eric Bolin earlier in the show, but look, inflation is breaking out all over the world. It's not going to escape the United States. We're not going to emerge scot-free from this thing because it's all a monetary phenomenon, and it starts with us because we issue the world's reserve currency. We are exporting inflationary monetary policy all around the globe, and it's going to come back and bite us in the tuchus. These chickens that we set out are going to come home to roost right here where they were grown in the U.S. of A. Anyway, that's it for today's show. We are running out of time. Thanks for the callers. Thanks for listening. This is Peter Schiff on The Peter Schiff Show on SchiffRadio.com, the gold standard in talk radio.